Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this evening's webinar. My name is Darren, and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. I'm Programme Chair of our Masters in Climate Change, Policy, Media and Society, and Co-Director of our new DCU Centre for Climate and Society. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. The latest landmark assessment of climate change research by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was published on Monday, focusing on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. Over the course of the next hour, we will examine how Ireland and the world can respond to the report's findings. We have an excellent lineup of expert panelists from academia, policy and civil society to explore these questions with us. Our discussion will be moderated by Kevin O'Sullivan. Kevin is Environment and Science Editor of the Irish Times, and since his appointment to this role, he has done stellar work to cover the climate crisis in the pages of the Irish Times. And I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the vital contribution to media coverage of climate change you've made, Kevin, and I'm very grateful to you also for agreeing to moderate this evening's discussion. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Dermot, and thanks very much for your remarks about our coverage. It's such a huge issue, and I think it's more than necessary at this time. Welcome to everyone. I'm delighted that you joined us in such great numbers. As Dermot has indicated, this latest IPCC report details how the climate crisis has caused widespread adverse impacts and related loss and damage to nature and people. It forms the second part of the IPCC sixth assessment and follows the first element, which came last August, which was produced by Working Group 1. And as you all probably know, that focused on the physical science basis of the Earth's changing climate. The second report that we got this week presents the latest evidence on impacts of climate change and the ways of adapting to them. It details how the rise in weather and climate extremes has led to some irreversible impacts as natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. It charts in many instances how they can combine to cause cascading effects. It also reveals 40% of the world's population is directly threatened by the climate crisis, and that unless we act urgently, the harm to our planet will only grow. It also provides evidence to show with every delay, the scale of the crisis grows. Hurricanes and wildfires are becoming more frequent, and climate-driven droughts are forcing millions into poverty. But it doesn't have to be this way, it suggests, and I think that's a very interesting part of the core of this report. And I think that should be a part of the focus of our discussions here today. It underlines that by taking action now to cut and protect nature and support climate vulnerable communities, we can save lives and futures of many millions of people and restore biodiversity. But what does that exactly mean for a rich country like Ireland? What does it mean for those least responsible for our climate and biodiversity crisis, and those who are already suffering and are least able to adapt? So I hope our distinguished panel can provide answers on all of that for you. I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, who's Sadhbh O'Neill. She's Assistant Professor at the School of Law and Government at DCU, and she has a long record in climate activism. Sadhbh, welcome. And I know your recent work spans both academia, activism, and policy making. And I know myself, you're a keen IPCC watcher, and that comes with a lot of technical jargon that you have to wrestle with. But what are your key takeaways from this week's report, and what implications does it have for our response to the climate crisis here in Ireland?
Thanks very much, Kevin. Lovely to join everybody here today. I suppose the question that you've asked is put to me as an activist, academic and aspiring policymaker, but like everyone else, no matter how often I have to read about the impacts of climate change, I get a knot in my stomach reading these reports, realizing not just how vulnerable we are here in Ireland, but the extent of the vulnerability of millions of people in the world who are much less able to adapt for reasons of poverty and geography. It's absolutely terrifying, this report, and I'm not sure that it's received enough attention, because obviously recent events this week have eclipsed the coverage that would normally be expected with the report. But I would urge anyone here this evening to go and look it up. And we were just saying earlier that there are a number of excellent kind of summaries of the report that summarize each chapter, and they're worth reading because each chapter on its own is terrifying. And when you add them all together, it's daunting. So the answer to your question, Kevin, is that it's actually too big for one person. It's too big for one sector or one country. It's going to take a whole of society response, a coordinated global response with much greater leadership and authority at the level of the UN. And I have to say as well, as an academic, that we need to be activists. Universities need to be activists. As innovators, educators, and institutions, countries need to be activists. Activists need to be supported, and our message must be normalized. It should not be controversial or contestable to say that the climate and biodiversity crisis is the biggest threat that we're facing. It's just simply the truth. But it's not always about pointing fingers either, and it means that we have to find ways of working together for social and political change. And I suppose that's the part that I'm interested in terms of the politics of climate action and biodiversity action. I just want to say one other thing, which is that the report for me is a very interesting read in the sense that it combines the sort of physics of what's happening to the atmosphere with the human impacts. So it's much easier to read than some of the scientific reports from the IPCC. It's very relatable, and they have regional chapters that explain what's going to happen in different places. But the link for me that's most important is between climate action and biodiversity action, because in Ireland, we are looking at over 85% of our habitats that are in a poor, degraded condition. And the drivers of all this degradation are exactly the changes we need to make in order to become more resilient, and so that we can adapt better to the climate changes that we can expect in Ireland. One official that I spoke to about the report, who's a senior official in the Department of Housing, said that her role was like watching everything die. All the ecosystems that we need to be protecting in Ireland are under threat, and they're getting worse because we're not investing in nature conservation and restoration. So I'm sure I've run out of my 3-minute slot here, but I think in terms of the Irish focus, we need to be bringing those two pieces together. The policy agenda for biodiversity needs to be matched up and aligned with both the planetary and global crisis, but it also needs to be matched with our domestic climate action. And currently, that's just not the case.
Great. Well, thank you for that. That's a really good sort of tee-up introduction to our webinar, and you raise the big issues, but also the difficulties and some degree of hope, which is good. Just to remind everyone, you can put questions on the Q&A format, and we'll try and get around to as many of them during the hour. And I think the best advice is to put them in as soon as you think of them, rather than trying to pitch them at the end. Our next speaker is Dr. Darren Clarke, who's Assistant Professor in the School of History and Geography at DCU. So Darren, I know your research to date has focused on the concept of transformative adaptation. Can you explain what that means and how useful it is in the context of this week's IPCC report? It seems to me that it's an issue that is all too often ignored.
Absolutely, and thanks very much, Sadhbh. You've teed me up nicely to some of the issues that I have identified from the report. So basically, when we talk about responding to the impacts of climate change, there are 3 fundamental things we can do. We can decide to do nothing, which you could argue in a large part we have done nothing to date. We can adapt incrementally, or we can respond incrementally, which fundamentally means making adjustments, making small changes to existing practices and policies. But we know that incremental adaptation to climate change isn't always effective at helping people or ecosystems to reduce their vulnerabilities to climate change. An incremental adaptation, fundamentally, it only modifies the social or ecological system to actually only accommodate changes. So it doesn't fundamentally change the characteristics of the system. So people may still be vulnerable. And a good example when we think of this in the context of Ireland is when it comes to climate change would be building higher flood defences in flood prone areas. The flood defence itself might accommodate increased risk of flooding in the future, but people still remain vulnerable to flood risks if the defence is breached. And this is where the third option comes in. This is where transformative adaptation or transformative change comes in, because instead of these incremental adaptations, these minor modifications to systems or to structures, people can also respond to, for example, if we're using the case of flood risk, they can respond to floods by fundamentally transforming the actual system. And that might be, for example, relocating houses or relocating individuals away from flood prone areas, or moving agricultural activity away from areas that are prone to climate extremes to safer areas. And transformative adaptation, it therefore fundamentally changes the entire system, the ecological or the social functions of that system. And it gets to the root causes of vulnerability, particularly related to the social, the cultural, the economic, the environmental, and more importantly, probably the power relations between how those things play out. And it transforms them into more sustainable and resilient states. And I think when you ask Kevin about what the IPCC report states about adaptation and transformative change, I would say there are probably three key messages in the report for me when it comes to adaptation and transformative adaptation. The first message I would say is the report is very, very explicit to state that globally, adaptation in general, whether that be incremental or transformative, is well below what's necessary to reduce climate change impacts. And the overwhelming majority of all finance that we put into climate change to date has been focused on mitigation, which is very important, but adaptation is also an essential component of that, how we'll actually respond to a warming climate. The second point that I think is fundamental coming out of the report is where adaptation is happening, it tends to be fragmented, it tends to be incremental if it's happening at all, and it tends to be very sector specific. So going back to Sadhbh's point about the integration of the climate and biodiversity crisis, we can't see them as siloed. We can no longer think of things in a siloed way, that this is this sector's responsibility, this is another sector's responsibility. These things are all interlinked, and it reduces fundamentally, if we choose the approach where we're going down that siloed sector-specific route and it's fragmented and it's incremental, it reduces the opportunity for transformative change in the long term, fundamental changes in the long term to systems. And I think probably the third and final point I'd like to make is one of the key things to come out of this report, different to the last reports, is climate resilient development is stamped all over the report, particularly if you look at the policy summary for policymakers. At the very end, there's about 20% of the entire summary for policymakers is given up to climate resilient development. And in simple terms, what that is integrating adaptation and mitigation policies in a coherent way, that they're not seen as mitigation is one sector's responsibility or one organization's or one part of an organization's responsibility, and adaptation another. These are connected issues, and if we work collectively, that climate resilient development can happen, but mitigation and adaptation need to be seen as the same sides of the one coin. So they're the three messages I would take from when it comes to the report itself.
Very good. Thank you very much, Darren. That was really, really helpful as well. And you sort of open up another front, which we'll come back to later on. Our third speaker is Dr. Sinead Walsh. She is a climate director with the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I think she's the nearest thing we have to a climate envoy in Ireland, our version of John Kerry. So we're delighted to have you here today with us, Sinead. And I know many of the countries that you and your colleagues in the Department of Foreign Affairs are on, working on the front line of climate change impacts, and you see directly what's happening. But how do these latest findings of the IPCC translate in that context? And one issue arising from that, I think, is does it provide enough momentum to really solve the loss and damage issue? And I know Ireland has been pushing that, and it was very prominent in COP26 in doing that. But is this now the catalyst that will help us to get all that over the line?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And I think, Darren, rather than teeing me up, I think you stole my best lines. So I'll try to be creative here, but I actually think it shows how much commonality we have between the Irish context and the international context that we work on. I mean, I think, Kevin, I'd start by saying we're either very wise or very lucky in the Irish, Irish Aid and the other departments who spend climate finance, because we already spend the vast majority of it on adaptation. And so I suppose we feel kind of vindicated by the fact that this report puts such a huge emphasis on that, because it is the poor relation, adaptation finance compared to mitigation. And I think we're hoping, as you say, that this will provide a whole pile of proof, really, that's been, agreed by 195 countries. I think, that the needs are so absolutely enormous for adaptation. It's also very timely for us. So we at the moment, as Irish Aid and between Department of Environment, Agriculture and Finance, we spend about 90 million euros a year on climate finance, and as I say, the vast majority on adaptation. But we'll be more than doubling that, as some people may have heard the Taoiseach announce at COP, and we're actually putting together the roadmap at the moment. So I think this report is great kind of food for thought and reflection as we do that, and kind of gives us some useful directions. And is, I think, an advocacy tool. I'll come on to loss and damage, but even just for adaptation, I think it's a really big advocacy tool, and it's difficult to escape from just the enormity of what it sets out that's going to be needed, and those up to 3.6 billion people in the highly vulnerable category. But I think it also I think gives us some really useful directions on quality, and that's probably where I suppose I would see a bit more of the new information, because when you work on adaptation on a day-to-day basis, there's certainly a lot of that's very recognizable in this report. But I think they also hit on some really interesting and kind of controversial points in terms of quality, and Darren mentioned some of them already. The extent to which what a lot of us do is quite fragmented, but also this concept of maladaptation, where with the best intentions and the best will in the world, we might actually be making things worse by growing forests in on the wrong land and so on. So I certainly can't pretend that we've discussed this report in all its detail yet internally with our NGO partners and our colleagues in African countries, but I think there are some important things in there that we need to think about, and particularly the point, Darren, that you made about the need for us to just be thinking, and the report's really good on this, of much more integrated, long-term, multi-sectoral, multi-country projects in many cases on adaptation. I will say a lot of what we do on Irish Aid in African countries does tend to be in sectors like agriculture, and that's obviously very important. That's huge in the report, but I think the report sort of challenges us to say, look, this is in every sector, and if you're not looking for adaptation needs in every sector, then you really need to do that. And maybe just to add, I mean, it's not enough, I suppose, just to talk about what we're doing. In Ireland, we were part of this whole, developed country, kind of scene, and we actually have been trying to influence the broader set of countries on adaptation finance. We co-founded a group actually last year called the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance, and that's looking at quantity issues and the doubling of adaptation finance that we all agreed to at COP, but it's also looking at the quality issues, and I think this report will be really helpful for us, and challenges us to do more on the nature front. I think that came across really powerfully, as Sadhbh said, doing more in cities. We do tend to do a lot of rural work. But then finally, Kevin, just on loss and damage. Yeah, I mean, I think it's good. It comes out here quite well. One of the things that I like a lot in the report on loss and damage is that it talks about the non-economic losses. So it talks about things like cultural heritage, sites in Africa, for example, a lot of them will be in coastal areas, like the rest of the world, and what, when you're looking at sea level rise and all these kind of issues, what's that going to do to, it's not just about GDP, it's not just about livelihoods, it's also about, people's spiritual life, people's cultural life, and that's actually an area within the loss and damage conversation that, as you know, Ireland is very focused on at the moment, and we're in my team, we're involved in quite a lot of work on this. And actually, we found that to be quite a neglected area, the non-economic side of it. So I think this is more grist to the mill now for us to be able to advocate more strongly on that. So I'll leave it at that, Kevin.
Very good. And I think that whole idea of a holistic response, I think it's new territory for the IPCC, but I think it stitches together things in a much better and a much more meaningful way. So thank you for that, Sinead. Our final speaker and panelist is Clare O'Connor. She's Energy Policy Officer with the Friends of the Earth Ireland, and we're delighted to have you here, Clare. I know you recently joined Friends of the Earth in a policy and advocacy role, but I'm going to ask you to open up another front on the whole issue about energy, because I know a lot of your work relates to that. So if you could give us your views on the report, and also on the issue of how the current energy crisis is impairing the response, and will the IPCC report help us get back on track?
Thanks very much, Kevin. So yeah, for me, the new report has really highlighted the injustice of this crisis, and it's telling us that climate change is already causing widespread disruption to human and to planetary health, and to the 3.5 billion people worldwide who are now vulnerable. It's not just words on paper, it's a very real lived experience for them. And I think it's really important that we do note that. And without urgent action, the crisis is only going to get worse. And yeah, we now know that we have the ability to mobilise resources in the face of an urgent threat. And I think the challenge now for the Irish government will be to show leadership and to respond in a way that reflects this urgency. And what this report means for Ireland then, and particularly for our work with Friends of the Earth, is that we have to now advocate for three things. So the first thing is for ramped up action on our domestic adaptation policy. And secondly, we need to show leadership on an international level on climate finance and on loss and damage and rights-based approaches. And thirdly, we need to, as you said, Kevin, we need to prevent fossil fuel lock-in and to urgently phase out fossil fuel subsidies. So firstly, looking at our domestic adaptation policy at the moment, back in December, our Climate Change Advisory Council highlighted the fact that very little progress has been made in many of our sectors in terms of adaptation policy, particularly in our health sector, our electricity and gas networks, and that has real potential to leave us incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's really important that adaptation planning features strongly in our response across all government sectors. And I know the Climate Action Plan this year has actually committed to a public consultation on the National Adaptation Framework in the first quarter of this year, so probably in the next few weeks. And this IPCC report highlighted again and again the dangers of maladaptation and the importance of people-centred adaptation. And that means that all of our plans for adaptation, they really have to value local knowledge, and they really have to build adaptive capacity through our community-led responses. And I think from Friends of the Earth, we're really looking forward to seeing this public consultation by the end of this month on our adaptation framework. And then secondly, looking at our response on an international stage. As a polluting country, we really need to take our responsibility to provide aid and assistance to the global south more seriously. I know you said that we showed leadership on loss and damage at COP26, Kevin, but I would actually disagree. And I think the EU actually blocked poorer countries' requests for a separate loss and damage facility at COP26. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done for loss and damage. Our Friends of the Earth will be calling upon the Irish government to set up a separate loss and damage financial facility. And then as well as that, there's much more progress that needs to be made in terms of adaptation. I know our Stop Climate Chaos partners, Clarke and Sinead, have done research to say that based on our previous emissions and based on our wealth, we should be providing €500 million annually in terms of climate adaptation finance, and which is significantly more than the 225 that's committed at the moment. And I agree with Sinead that any of this finance has to be new, additional, and it has to be high quality finance as well for adaptation. And I think it's really encouraging that the department is prioritising that as well. And then the third thing is that the government policy needs to respond to the main driver of the climate crisis, which is fossil fuels. And this also, as you said, will line up with our response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And on one hand, we need to prioritise the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies, which we've committed to building a roadmap on by 2024, which is, it's not good enough really, because the Citizens Assembly have been calling for the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies since 2017. And then on the other hand, we need to phase out fossil fuel production. And at COP26, we did become a founding member of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is really exciting, but we now need to prioritise these objectives at an EU level, and also to support an international treaty to really prevent fossil fuel exploration and expansion. Yeah, and I suppose the IPCC reports, they've been coming out for a very long time, and governments and politicians, despite knowing these impacts, they have yet to act. There really is a big gap there, and I think it's on us now to bridge that gap and to create a really strong climate justice movement in Ireland.
Very good, and thank you for that, Clare. And just in terms of, people are a bit conflicted at the moment with the energy issue, in the sense that they're being, facing huge energy costs, and yet, they accept the need to decarbonize. And how do you feel they should, respond in terms of trying to advance the climate argument? And yet, everywhere you look, people are relying on gas, and some countries falling back on coal. It's a very complex, messy scenario, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think at Friends of the Earth, we have always called for the prevention of the expansion of gas and no new gas. And we need to get off coal, we need to get off oil, which we are still relying on in 2022, which is absolutely mad. And I think, yeah, it's really important that that transition is done in a just way.
Okay, thank you for that. And thank you to all our panel for their introductory remarks. I have a few quick questions, and then we're going to roll it out to the wider audience. So keep the questions coming in. Thank you very much. I see they're already rolling out, so I'm glad to see that. Just one sort of explainer issue. When you say, Clare, and I'm going to ask Sinead this as well, but maladaptation, what does that mean, or what does that look like, say, in Ireland? Like, is it to do with putting flood defences in the wrong place, or what sort of, how would you give an example of it?
I think from what I've read in the report, it's that it's not high quality adaptation measures, and it's adaptations that were designed maybe not with the community involved and in mind, and aren't high quality. But maybe Sinead can speak a bit more on that, because it's not something that I would know about.
Right. Well, thank you. I'll ask Sinead that in terms of the developing, what would be a manifestation of maladaptation?
Yeah, I think the main one that I got, Kevin, from what I've read so far of the report is the forestry. That seems to be the one that, as far as I know, they found the most evidence of. So, kind of, and so I would probably have a few things to say about this, because I would imagine it may link to some issues like, Article 6 and countries paying other countries to, grow a bunch of forests so that they can trade off the emissions. So, there were examples where they said that growing trees in the wrong places were actually bad for biodiversity and bad for water, and so I suppose it was a very tokenistic kind of approach, but it actually did more harm than good, and sort of boxes were ticked, presumably in the various countries and maybe by the various donors and so on, but actually it was it was a poor investment, and I think that's important, because I feel like we don't. and you know, this is maybe those of us who've been advocating for adaptation finance to increase, you know, we're maybe partly to blame for this, that because it's always gotten so much less attention than mitigation, then we really push, you know, and then we really want more money to spend on it and so on and so forth. But that can maybe make us more reluctant to talk about some of the ways in which it goes badly, you know. So I think this, I quite liked that coming out of this IPCC report, that there was a sort of a frank acknowledgement that there's not enough, but also some of the stuff is not very good. And let's just be frank about that.
Okay, Sadhbh, do you want to come in on that?
I'd say it's more Darren's field than mine, actually.
Right, okay.
On the maladaptation. I was just going to come up with one example, but I think that Darren is better placed than me to answer that.
Okay.
Darren. Yeah, I think Sinead's kind of just hit on the idea. It's as much about the damages, potentially the future damages, when you plan adaptation in a way that potentially in the long term you need to adjust that adaptation or modify that adaptation in the future, and it could cause long-term damages or long-term consequences, negative consequences for planning and for adapting in the future. And that example in the IPCC report, in the report this year, is about, particularly focused on forestry, is as much about damaging biodiversity and contributing to biodiversity loss, as well as contributing to potentially increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Because if we disturb soils that are particularly effective at taking in carbon dioxide, and we disturb them to grow forests in particular regions of the world that aren't suitable for growing forests, we release carbon into the atmosphere, and potentially that carbon is not taken back in the same level as it would be through the planting of trees. So it's this idea of adapting for the sake of adapting. It's not necessarily always right. It needs to be context specific in the location in which it's planned. Otherwise, as the report outlines, it can have negative long-term consequences if we try and adapt in the future. So I think that's basically it.
Grand. And can you just extend that a little to the National Adaptation Plan in Ireland? It seems to me that it's far from being a complete document, and that if you factor in the findings of this report, that it's way short of what's required. What would your view be on that?
Yeah, my view on that would be that adaptation, whether it's from the IPCC stating that it's massively underfunded in general, globally, and in Ireland, it's the same. I think two areas I would see for Ireland when it comes to adaptation, that the first is probably the obvious one. It's raining today, which we all probably, well, it's raining here in Dublin anyway, and flood risks are the primary risks which we adapt to in Ireland. Probably a lesser known one, or not adapt, as the case may be, plans were for the Office of Public Works to invest €1 billion in structural flood defences, primarily structural flood defences, over the period 2020 to 2030 or thereabouts, €1 billion in flood defences. And in much the same way as putting forests in the wrong place can lead to maladaptation, equally, flood defences in the wrong location at the wrong time could tie us or lock us into sustaining those flood defences in the long term, which might not be best for the individuals concerned that are protected. And that's where maladaptation can come in as well. We lock ourselves into potentially future pathways. But the other area, just very briefly, Kevin, the other area in Ireland that we don't talk about enough is, when it comes to adaptation, is drought. And colleagues of mine in Maynooth University have done research extensively on drought. And I think it's an area that I think will need to be looked at a lot more in the future when it comes to planning for drought and water shortages for agricultural and domestic use in the future. Very
good. Thank you for that. Sadhbh, I know you will be able to answer this question, because I know you think a lot about this particular issue. I think the report is quite striking in acknowledging the impact on humanity in terms of well-being, in terms of health, and I think the first time an IPCC report refers to human stress and stress from extreme flooding and that. And on top of that, I would think that people have a lot of eco-anxiety, and I think that this report, while there are some really good ways of progressing matters, I think might even add to people's distress. And how do you feel people should respond and sort of park that and move on and embrace the good things and the actions that are set out in this report?
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels eco-anxiety, but the first thing I reach for when I'm stressed about these reports is I reach for Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark book. Now, it was actually Friends of the Earth that introduced me to that book. It wasn't on my own kind of environmental politics reading list. And the idea now for me of introducing students and undergraduates to the politics of climate change and environmental impacts without introducing them to that book is unthinkable. The very first couple of sentences in the book is, your opponents would love you to believe that it's hopeless, that you have no power, that there's no reason to act, that you can't win. Hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. And hope is an act of defiance. And I think, you know, when we're feeling the weight of this terrible burden of foreknowledge about the sort of impacts that are coming, there's a couple of really important things. Certainly, first is that wherever there's human agency, and the IPCC authors were so good at stressing this at the press conference on Monday, wherever there's a possibility of human agency, there is hope. But that's going to require collective and concerted action. It's going to have to require a shift in priorities so that the planetary boundaries concept, or as some people were mentioning in the comments, Kate Raworth's donut, you know, economy model becomes the paradigm. So we have to shift the paradigm, and social and political change is never easy, and it's usually not very quick. But I think we're heading into a time of great change, and that will bring also risks and opportunities. So what's happening in the Ukraine at the moment is an example of, it's a kind of a symptom, and we saw it before in Syria and in other places, a symptom of a kind of planetary stress, where you have a combination of forces coming together, including, you know, abuses of human rights and autocratic regimes and corruption and everything else. But all of these things are in the mix. And we as human beings are just part of this big ecosystem that involves other people's and the built environment, the natural environment, and other countries, and all of the institutions we've built up as part of our civilization. So it's all going to have to change. And the stark thing about the adaptation agenda, unlike the mitigation agenda, although you probably could argue that the mitigation agenda does too, is that it's hyper-local. So, you know, you can use different ways of adapting in different fields, in different parts of the same county of Ireland. So it is a wonderful opportunity for people to come together and start to appreciate what it is that makes an ecosystem function and what ecosystem services they actually rely on. And one of the things that I've learned from delving into this report is that biodiversity is not about bees and butterflies per se. It's about the whole structure of ecosystems, the way water and soils and climate and all of these different plants and animals work together, interact in a dynamic way, and provide these functions to us. So we have to reintegrate ourselves into that. So I think that's the job.
Right. Okay, so I see you, Clare, you were nodding there. You're representing a climate NGO and an activist organization. How do you feel that can be really scaled up?
In terms of the eco-anxiety, do you mean?
No, in terms of responding and in terms of ending the incremental actions, in terms of getting that new degree of cooperation and agitation and a sort of a stronger collective response.
Yeah, I think there is so much scope for a stronger collective response. And I think Sadhbh is right, it is a really good antidote to that eco-anxiety or the feelings of hopelessness that do often arise when we're reading these types of report. And I think there's scope for every person here tonight to really think about their level of agency. And I think agency is a great word as well. And think of where they can have influence in their lives. And I think there's so much room for collective action in Ireland and to build that climate justice movement. There's the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, which is so many different member organizations, which are all doing really incredible work. And across each of those member organizations, there's scope to get involved. And from Friends of the Earth, we have local One Future groups all over the country at the moment who are really doing incredible work on that local level. And I think, yeah, there's so much energy that you can really bring from being part of a collective and getting involved in the movement.
Very good. Thanks a million for that. And now I'm going to open the questions to our audience, and there's a great mix of questions, and I'm going to pitch the first one at Sinead. Question here from Brian Gray. Do you think we have the level of policy urgency to create transformative change and get a whole of society response in Ireland? And how do we achieve that?
How much time do we have? I think we're getting better. I think we have, I think depending on who you speak to, I think there's a DCU UCD divide on this, but we either have the most ambitious emissions plan in the history of the world, or the second most. I think there's a bit of a debate about Denmark and Ireland, but either way, we have a hugely ambitious plan, act, legally binding act, which is certainly a good start. It's by no means going to get us where we need to go, as I think everybody on this call knows, but if we didn't have it, it would be a huge problem. So I think we can see, I mean, I can just tell you from the volume of briefing requests that my climate unit gets every day from the political system, this is just, it's just coming up in every meeting across the board. It's not just sort of, I suppose kind of as a civil servant, I can tell you, it's not that, oh, we only get these requests when the Green Party is involved. It is absolutely across the board, in terms of the three parties that are in coalition, and in terms of also pushing us, why aren't we doing more on this and that and the other, which is really quite welcome. So I think the emphasis from where I sit, I mean, my day-to-day work is on international stuff, so I'm not the best place to talk about this, but from where I sit, political momentum has really increased, and obviously we have the law, we have the plan, and all of that, but obviously implementation is the hardest thing of all, and I think in every country, Sadhbh, you mentioned the word hyperlocal, and I think in every country, when you start looking at the real barriers, they can really seem, really difficult and insurmountable, but we've got to find a way. And, people have mentioned the Ukraine crisis. If we look at what's happened in the last week to 10 days in terms of policy at the EU level and what we might have expected, it just shows you.
Yeah.
I mean, look at what we did for COVID. We can respond to a crisis. So, but, when are we going to see the climate crisis with that sort of, we're so bad as human beings at looking at long-term risks, aren't we? And seeing them as with the same urgency as the short-term risks. So I suppose it's a challenge for all of us in our different capacities on how we try to help that shift happen in society, and then in terms of the political system.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And in relation to that, and narrowing the focus a little, and you refer to it, I have a question for Sadhbh from Sandra McCullough, and that is in relation to the Climate Action Plan. She says, I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on Ireland's Climate Action Plan and what improvements can we make to the next plan, which is due later this year, to take account of this latest IPCC report?
Yeah, great question. Well, the first thing is that the Climate Action Plan is looking at mitigation in isolation from adaptation. And it's also looking at mitigation in isolation from what's required now in the new EU biodiversity plan. So it doesn't have a biodiversity chapter, and it doesn't address the potential trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation and between climate action and biodiversity action. And that might sound like an academic abstraction, as someone was saying, but what it really boils down to in Ireland is how we manage land. because when it comes to the sort of more technical side of emission reduction on energy and emissions from industry and things like that, it's kind of pretty obvious what we have to do. But when it comes to the land use side, it's very complex, because you can make interventions in land use that are beneficial in terms of reducing emissions, but have terrible effects on biodiversity and water and ecosystem function. So, managing our land and addressing that recommendation in both the EU and in the IPCC report of restoring between 30 and 50% of all land, coastal and marine environments is going to be an enormous challenge. Are we ready to step up to that? And what does it mean for us? We, as a state, own very little land. The land is fragmented amongst many thousands of owners, hundreds of thousands. And there's a real challenge at a policy level in finding policy levers. Unlike carbon taxes, there isn't an equivalent measure you can introduce that achieves all your goals in one go. And even the carbon tax might be somewhat inefficient as well. But when it comes to land use, there's going to be multiple policy changes needed. And unfortunately, the model that we're working under, notwithstanding all the improvements, is still very much within the sort of the paradigm of extracting resources from the land and shipping them off as dairy and meat products. And unfortunately, It's not going to work.
Yeah, well, I think you're so right in terms of the big piece that's missing in the jigsaw, and that is land use and land use planning. So anyway, thank you for that. I have a question here from Olivia Ryan, which is for Darren. She's grateful to hear about transformative adaptation, as she's always felt the solutions presented are often short-sighted and not necessarily taking in the reasons for flooding in the first place, alongside the impact on ecology as well as on people. But her question is, how can transformative adaptation actually be implemented? What does that look like in practice?
So this comes, that's a really good question, and it's a complex question. I think one of my favorite lines of one of my favorite TV shows is Father Ted, when Ted is explaining to Dougal, the great thing about Catholicism is that it's a bit vague and no one really knows what it's all about. That is basically, when it comes to transformative adaptation, it's a little bit vague. It means different things to different people in different contexts. What's transformative in an Irish context is very different to what's transformative in South Sudan, for example, where Sinead has worked. So it's very context specific, but broadly speaking, it's not about looking at things in an isolated, fragmented way. It's not about looking just the risk of flooding as an issue. It's about looking at the broader picture of, okay, how can we solve flooding in the context of climate change, improving people's livelihoods, improving biodiversity, etc. And it's about looking at the bigger picture and trying to actually reduce the root cause of any vulnerability that happens. So it's not about basically putting a sticky plaster over something in the hope that the wound will heal, which is typically what incremental adaptation does. For example, the likes of flood defences in Ireland. It's about fundamentally deciding, are these places, when it comes to flooding, are they actually going to be long-term prone to flooding? And should we actually make more drastic solutions to begin to move, or at least consider moving people away from these areas in the first instance? And that's where, if we take Ireland as an example, that's where transformative change might actually look like. It might be a case of, okay, we can no longer protect these people in vulnerable areas. We now need to start at least the discussion around moving people away, or at least considering other alternatives, like if it's not high structural flood defences, it's the likes of re-wetting lands further upstream of a particular river, if it's river flooding, so that potentially we could use that as a storage area to reduce risk downstream for communities. And these are fundamental ideas that we haven't really played with yet to a large extent, not just in Ireland, but globally. So it's very context specific to the area in which it happens. And that Father Ted line is probably as close to as what you're going to get to an actual response on what it looks like in different communities.
Very good. And I think you've really given a good in-depth explanation of all that. So thank you very much. There's a general question here from Alan Moore, which I think is worth putting, and I think, Clare, you might be best placed to answer it. He's wondering, do the panel agree that we must continue to call out those who, for self-serving purposes, try to create and perpetuate a division between so-called environmentalists and others, when most reasonable people now understand that we are all in this together?
If the question is, do I agree that we must continue to call them out, then yes, we absolutely should continue to call people out who try and create divisions and polarities in this. It's a societal level response, and everyone is going to be impacted by it. And I think people who are trying to be divisive at the moment, I don't think they are serving themselves in the long term at all. And I think it is really important to call that out. And I do think that most people do now understand that we're all in this together. And the most important thing is that we now create a plan of how we're going to respond, and really just to get to that implementation stage, we need to start taking action there.
Very good. Thank you. Very good response. And I have a question here for Sinead, and I just know there's an international context as well, but this question from Brendan Mulligan notes that many local are preparing 6-year development plans just now. Very difficult to get any change made to draft plans, only token references to sustainable development goals, no commitment to achieving the SDGs. Any advice on how to change that?
So specifically, no, in that I'm not involved in that, but
That's fair enough. Yeah.
I did want, but I think it's kind of relevant actually to a couple of things I did want to say. I mean, one is, Kevin, you had made reference to the National Adaptation Framework, I think, and I think, you know, that's, I suppose, a bit of an umbrella for a lot of these other plans. I think a lot of people on this call, maybe everybody in this call, will want to input into the review of that, because it's a 2018 document. I think we all know how much has changed since 2018 in terms of climate change and what we know, and so on, and what was agreed at COP and everything. So I just wanted to make sure that people knew that by the end of this month, there'll be a public consultation launched on that. And I think a lot of the points, I'm not even managing to read all the points in the chat, but I think a lot of the points in the chat, you know, would demonstrate that a lot of people on this call will have views for that, you know, for that process. The other thing that I haven't really heard, you know, unless I missed it because I was trying to listen and look at some comments in the chat at the same time, is a reference to voting. Have we mentioned yet voting? We've talked about activism, but what about voting?
No.
I mean,
no.
Is there a more powerful? Is there a more powerful form of activism? And you know, like, you know, who we put in the hot seat is so critically important. So it's a bit more big picture, I think, than the question is asking. But I think you know, I often speak to youth activists, you know, who are over 18. But you know, when I push them on whether or not they vote, as well as strike and protest and so on, they often confess that they don't yet. And so I think we just need to put that on the table as well, as a form of activism. But yeah, I don't have knowledge really of the specific planning process.
That's fair enough.
There.
Yeah, no, I was really just raising the point from the point of view of a focus on SDGs, because I think they can be a great indicator of progress or not. And you know, we have committed to them. We played a key role in getting them there in the first place. And it just seems that it's too much of a side issue in Ireland when it should be an overriding issue. That's my view. But anyway, but thank you for that. I have a question here, and we're going to bring proceedings to a close soon. But I have a question here from Tom Murphy on the issue of carbon setting. And he says that lots of businesses are claiming to be carbon neutral, but they're often claiming this on the basis of factoring in offsetting into their calculations. The offsetting could often be maladaptation, in his opinion. And is this just a greenwashing tactic? So maybe Sadhbh, you wanted to come in on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Offsetting is a complicated area. And without getting into all the detail, despite efforts over many years to strengthen the global framework for voluntary bilateral emissions trading between countries and firms and that kind of thing, the reality is that the voluntary carbon market is exploding. So this is where companies, and we have some Irish ones, are advertising that you can offset your environmental impact because they've purchased carbon credits through verified independent companies. And what's actually happening here is that we are displacing the effort over time. We're putting it off into the future, because if you think that trees planted now are going to absorb carbon, you're wrong. It takes them at least 30 years to start sequestering carbon. So you can burn lots of petrol and diesel very quickly, but the trees will take 30 years to possibly, if ever, absorb the carbon. But secondly, you're doing it over space. So you're doing it over time by extending it into the future, and you're also getting other people to do what you should be doing. So instead of you or we in the Western world reducing our consumption of fossil fuels, or companies reducing their scope 1 to 3 emissions, which they are supposed to be doing, they're saying, no problem, we'll just get communities in developing countries who are desperate for finance and for sustainable jobs and ways to protect their forest resources to do the work for us instead. So there are enormous ethical issues that need to be really tackled head on. And the greenwashing piece comes in where companies are making claims, where they're actually saying this is a green product because we've offset. And there are some organizations in Europe that are actually now calling for all corporate claims around carbon neutrality, net zero, and offsetting to be banned in all advertising. But I think I just wanted to touch on one other question that came up, because it's really important, which is the assumption we make that the public understands this. And as long as the public is being bombarded with advertising, including these greenwashing claims, advertising for new cars and holidays and cheap flights and all of those, luxury consumption, where we're not telling people about the real environmental and ecological cost, people are confused, and greenwashing claims only make it worse. So we need much more resources going into public broadcasting. We need much firmer regulation of advertising and corporate standards and transparent reporting on emissions. And none of that stuff that we're being bombarded with on a daily basis should be allowed. Okay.
Well, that's a very strong message to bring our proceedings to a close. And thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists. I think it was a great hour, and I think the audience really appreciated it. I haven't, in all my webinars in the last 2 years, I haven't seen as busy a chat zone ever. So that's a good testament. There's lots of links there to different documents that you can get, and even reference to books, etc. And there's even a few comments praising you as panelists. So I just pass that on and thank you. And also in terms of summaries about the IPCC report this week, Carbon Brief also had a very interesting series of quotes from key authors, and that's very revealing as well. There are only something like 20 quotes, but I think the one from Dr. Carl Franco, who's one of the authors, really put it up in lights. And she said, a major take-home message from the report is the urgent need to take action in order to achieve a sustainable and climate resilient future. We can't wait, we can't postpone. The costs of inaction are too great, and we are not on track. So there is much more work to be done. And I think that's probably a good incentive for everyone here today to move on and to pursue meaningful action. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to the audience. And now back to Dermot.
Thanks very much, Kevin, again for moderating our discussion this evening. And you're too modest to say it, but I would say also your coverage of Monday's report in the Irish Times was excellent as well. Thank you also to our 4 expert panelists, Sadhbh, Darren, Sinead, and Clare. I would agree with Kevin that we've had a really rich discussion, moving from key aspects of the report on to, I think, a really helpful discussion of about what we can do, what the blockages are, and how we might begin to overcome them. As Kevin said, the chat has been very active. The Q&A function has been very active. I could see discussions among members of the audience. So although we weren't able to get to all of the questions in the time we had available, I hope that you were all paying attention to that chat as well as to the discussion among Kevin and the panelists. So thank you all very much for to the audience, to you, the audience, for your participation in the webinar. If you'd like to keep in touch with the work that we are doing here in DCU on climate change and society, please follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @DCU Climate, and sign up to the newsletter. I posted a link a couple of minutes ago to the newsletter in the chat. So thank you very much again to Kevin, to all of our panelists, and to all of you, our audience, for attending, and I hope you all have a good evening.